The woman historically identified as Empress Matilda was most likely born on the 7th of February 1102 at Sutton Courtenay, situated in Berkshire in southern England. Her father was King Henry IV of England. Henry held the position of the youngest son of William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, who, in 1066, had commanded an army across the English Channel and initiated the conquest of England from its Anglo-Saxon and Danish inhabitants. Henry had asserted his claim to the throne following the death of his brother, King William II, also known as William Rufus, 2 years prior to Matilda's birth. The previous king had been killed in a hunting accident, an event some regarded with suspicion. Matilda received her name from her mother, Matilda of Scotland, who was a daughter of King Malcolm III of Scotland, and his wife, the Anglo-Saxon royal princess, Margaret of Wessex. Owing to this lineage, Matilda could trace her ancestry to the Norman kings of England, the Dukes of Normandy, the kings of Scotland, and also the former Anglo-Saxon rulers of England who reigned before the Norman conquest. She was one of only 2 children born from the marriage of Henry and Matilda. The other was a boy named William Adelin, born approximately a year and a half after Matilda. As a male child, William became the heir to the throne upon his birth. But should anything befall him, Matilda would become Henry's heir, a prospect that presented difficulties in an era when rulers were, above all else, expected to demonstrate military leadership. Henry also fathered over 20 children through his mistresses, but these were considered illegitimate and consequently could not succeed him to the throne. Matilda was born into a political landscape in Western Europe that was considerably more intricate than it is in the present day. The fragmented nature of the region would significantly influence the entire course of her life. Matilda's father governed England, which at that time was already a reasonably centralized and unified kingdom, exercising increasing influence over the Welsh lords to the west and, for at least a temporary period, maintaining relatively good relations with Scotland, largely due to Henry's marriage to Matilda's mother, a Scottish princess. Matters were far more complex across the English Channel. Here, Henry and his extended family held sway over the Duchy of Normandy in the north, while also exerting influence over other territories, such as the County of Blois, through strategic marriage alliances. A king of France held court in Paris, but his authority by no means extended over a territory comparable to the modern French nation-state. Nevertheless, lords such as the Dukes of Normandy and the Lords of Anjou were nominally subordinate to the French king and owed him feudal allegiance. To the east, Germany was similarly fragmented into dozens of duchies, counties, and principalities. But as in France, there was a semblance of centralized authority embodied by the Holy Roman Emperors. At the time of Matilda's birth, Emperor Henry IV held the title of Holy Roman Emperor, although from 1098 onwards, he had begun to rule in conjunction with his son and heir, the future Emperor Henry IV. Although it may have seemed like a distant land during her upbringing, events unfolding in Germany would come to play a role in Matilda's life from a very young age. A number of important medieval chronicles and historical accounts from the 12th century are still in existence and serve as the primary sources for information regarding Matilda's life and reign. There are also sections within numerous chronicles and histories pertaining to 12th century Germany that make reference to Matilda in connection with her marriage to the Holy Roman Emperor between 1114 and 1125. Many of the English chroniclers, including William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon, were contemporaries of Matilda and wrote extensively about her life and her claims to the English throne. A few of these accounts are favorable, though the majority present a negative portrayal of her, particularly the Gesta Stephani, which translates as the Acts of Stephen. This text, unsurprisingly given its title, offered a biased account in support of the claims that Matilda's cousin Stephen had to the English throne. Regrettably, a biographical history of Matilda's life written by the French bishop and chronicler, Arnulf of Lisieux, was lost during the late medieval period. This text would undoubtedly have provided further insights into her life, character, and her periods of authority in Germany, France, and England. Additionally, numerous historical accounts and analyses of Matilda's claims to the English throne were produced by Tudor historians in the 16th century, a period in which the rapid successions of Queen Mary the Wern and Queen Elizabeth the Wern in 1553 and 1558 prompted Englishmen to reconsider the history, validity, and nature of female monarchy. These historical records offer a somewhat fragmented account of Matilda's early life. She was raised in the environment of an itinerant court that frequently relocated between England and northern France, with her father and mother residing for periods at Westminster near London or at Rouen in Normandy. It was a large and extensive court, comprising lords from both England and France, where French served as the common language. Although she had only one full brother, Matilda grew up among a considerable number of nearly 24 illegitimate half-brothers and half-sisters, as well as numerous first cousins, including the children of her father's sister, Adela, Countess of Blois. She may have received some form of education and tutoring from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm, who was one of the most learned men in Christendom at the time prior to his death in 1109. Other monks and bishops would also have provided instruction to the children of the royal court during an era when educational standards in Europe were undergoing a significant period of advancement, a phenomenon that has led recent historians to refer to a 12th century Renaissance that foreshadowed the Italian Renaissance of the 15th century. Matilda's formal education was curtailed due to her position as a political asset in the intricate political landscape of Europe. As her father's sole legitimate daughter, the question of whom Matilda would marry was always destined to be a matter of considerable importance. As early as 1109, diplomatic discussions were underway between Matilda's father and Henry I, the Holy Roman Emperor and the most influential figure in Central Europe, concerning the potential marriage of the emperor to Matilda at some future point. Despite the age disparity of approximately 20 years between them, the overtures from such a prominent figure could not be disregarded. Consequently, in 1110, when she was merely 8 years old, Matilda was sent to Germany as part of a diplomatic delegation. The diplomats who accompanied her finalized the negotiations with the emperor. Notwithstanding her remarkably young age, Matilda's father consented to the formal betrothal of his daughter to the emperor. Thereafter, she was raised for the next 4 years in Western Germany with the specific aim of acclimatizing her to German culture and the language of the people over whom she would eventually reign as empress. Even by the norms of medieval Europe, the decision to hold a wedding ceremony in January 1114 in the city of Worms, when Matilda was still several weeks shy of her 12th birthday, while Henry V was at least in his late 20s and possibly as old as 33 years, was unusual. Typically, marriage ceremonies were not celebrated until the participants had reached at least 13 or 14 years of age and were considered to be entering their young adult years according to the standards of the period. Matilda would spend slightly over a decade holding the title of Holy Roman Empress, the most senior royal woman in Germany. This period coincided with a turbulent phase in imperial history, as her husband was effectively engaged in conflict with the papacy in Rome for control over northern Italy, a significant territory within the Holy Roman Empire at that time. Henry V had even been excommunicated by papal authority in 1112, 2 years before his marriage to Matilda. In the initial years following the marriage, Henry spent much of his time leading military campaigns south into the plain of Lombardy. After some time, Matilda joined him there, with her retinue and household staff, on one occasion in 1117, even progressing south towards Rome itself as the emperor attempted to seize the Eternal City. Curiously, despite her young age, Matilda was actively participating in political affairs by 1116 and 1117, with evidence suggesting her attendance at government councils and her role as an unofficial advocate for political measures presented at the imperial court. In 1117, she also asserted her claim to the title of Holy Roman Empress following Henry's victory in the military engagements in Italy. However, the title did not receive the official approval of Pope Paschal II, and whether she was legally entitled to call herself Empress or merely held the less senior imperial title of Queen of the Romans remained a subject of debate for years to come. Matilda consistently maintained that she was Empress Matilda, even long after she had departed from Germany. In 1118, Matilda's importance within her husband's government was made clear when he himself returned to Germany to suppress growing unrest among several feudal lords there, and entrusted Matilda with the responsibility of overseeing the imperial administration south of the Alps in his absence. She played significant roles during the subsequent years, notably in the resolution of the investitures controversy, a protracted dispute between successive Holy Roman emperors and popes that had persisted since 1076. The trajectory of Matilda's life was fundamentally altered by the events of the 25th of November, 1120. On that fateful evening, Matilda's brother and the heir to the English throne, William Adelin, embarked with a large company of nobles and courtiers to sail from Barfleur in Normandy across the Channel to England. In addition to William Adelin, several of the king's illegitimate children were on board, although Henry himself was not, having already made his own separate arrangements for sailing back to England. The party is widely believed to have consumed a considerable amount of alcohol before boarding the vessel named the White Ship, captained by a man named Thomas Fitzstephen. The ship did not travel far. Shortly after leaving the harbor of Barfleur, the vessel struck a submerged rock projecting from the seabed and quickly began to sink. Of the approximately 300 passengers on board, it is said that only one survived. Among those who perished was William Adelin, and with the death of her brother, the line of succession was thrown into complete disarray, as the king's only legitimate male heir was now deceased. Matilda would consequently become central to the debate concerning her father's succession. The White Ship incident would ultimately lead to a period of civil war known as the Anarchy in England and Normandy, during which Matilda's rightful place in the line of succession was challenged. In the immediate aftermath of the White Ship calamity, political instability gripped England and northern France. Henry had lost his only legitimate son and the obvious heir to his dominions. Now, only Matilda among his children was a legitimate offspring born within marriage and thus a potential successor. Many at this juncture might have believed that Henry would seek a new heir from outside his immediate family. Two potential candidates were his nephews, the sons of his sister Adela, Theobald, Count of Blois, and his younger brother Stephen. The latter might have been considered an especially likely heir. Henry had shown immense favor towards Stephen in the 1110s as he entered adulthood, bestowing upon him extensive lands and feudal honors in England and establishing him as the foremost figure in the Alençon region along the southern borders of the Duchy of Normandy. In retrospect, it appears as though Henry had been preparing Stephen as a potential alternative heir during these years, anticipating the possibility of some misfortune befalling William Adelin. Yet when the moment arrived to potentially designate him after the White Ship disaster, Henry made it unequivocally clear that Matilda was now his chosen successor. Despite her father's determined efforts to solidify her position as his heir, Matilda was only ever accepted by a minority of the individuals who held significant influence: the knights and lords of England and northern France, and the senior figures within the English church. When the time came for Henry to die and a successor to be crowned, whether Matilda would become queen or not depended on the willingness of these men to honor the king's expressed desires. Many harbored reluctance. While England would later accept female rulers in subsequent centuries, the prospect of a female monarch was viewed as problematic at a time when a ruler's primary duty was to lead their feudal subordinates into battle. One of the other difficulties presented by Matilda's potential succession was her status as an absentee heir. Back in 1114, she had married the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V. While this was a politically significant marriage to one of the most powerful figures in Europe at that time, it also meant that she was residing in Germany and other parts of Central Europe in the early 1120s, even as Henry was attempting to persuade his lords to accept her as his designated heir. In an era before any form of widespread communication technology, such as printing, a ruler's physical presence within their dominions was of paramount importance. This was why kings and queens regularly undertook journeys throughout their kingdoms in order to be seen in person and reassert their authority over their subjects. Matilda's absence in Germany compounded the difficulty of the situation. After all, the lords of England had essentially no direct knowledge of the individual to whom they were being asked to swear oaths in the early 1120s. Perhaps Matilda was a strong, poised woman who possessed the qualities necessary to become a good ruler one day. On the other hand, perhaps she was the complete opposite, a weak-willed, insignificant person who could not command respect as a potential heir. The crucial point was that no one could be certain, and this uncertainty made Henry's task all the more challenging. Ultimately, the English king's son-in-law, Emperor Henry IV, resolved this particular problem by dying prematurely in May 1125, likely from some form of cancer, while engaged in military campaigns in the Low Countries. He and Matilda had no surviving children, although, as previously noted, a child had been born years earlier but had died in infancy. The imperial title consequently passed to Lothair of Supplenburg, the Duke of Saxony. Freed from the obligations of her marriage and with no children or familial ties binding her to Germany, Matilda returned home to England in 1126. There her father's knights and lords would have had their first prolonged exposure to the woman whom Henry desired to rule over them one day. To some extent, they should have felt reassured. Matilda presented herself as a poised and capable woman, someone who might not have been able to lead them into battle in the traditional manner expected of a male ruler, but whom many would have believed possessed the qualities to make a capable queen. Nevertheless, others could never be convinced of the feasibility of a female monarch, and still others were more broadly dissatisfied with the high levels of taxation the king was imposing, which further fueled their opposition to his plans for the succession. After a period spent in England, Matilda crossed the English Channel and took up residence in Normandy. Here she continued to refer to herself as Empress Matilda, despite the death of her husband, the emperor, in 1125, an affectation that subsequent chroniclers and historians have been content to perpetuate, and Matilda remains known to history as Empress Matilda to this day. While in France, her father soon arranged another marriage for her. This time, the proposed groom was Geoffrey Plantagenet, the son and heir of the Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine. The counties of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine were considerable feudal territories situated to the south of Normandy, north of the county of Poitou, and to the west of Paris. They encompassed a substantial portion of north-central France, and thus Matilda's marriage to Geoffrey was, at least superficially, a shrewd political move that ensured Matilda would have financial and military support should she be compelled to fight for her crown after Henry's death. However, the marriage presented difficulties in other respects. Geoffrey was still 10 weeks short of his 15th birthday when they were married on the 17th of June 1128, and once he succeeded as Count of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine the following year, he quickly developed a reputation for heavy-handedness that provoked the animosity of some of the more minor lords of Normandy to the north. This further alienated some potential supporters of Matilda. Nevertheless, in the end, the resources that Anjou was able to contribute after Henry's death proved crucial in keeping Matilda's hopes of claiming the throne alive. The late 1120s and early 1130s were challenging years for Matilda. Much of this difficulty stemmed from the ongoing issues surrounding the succession. By this time, Matilda's first cousin, Stephen of Blois, was emerging as a clear rival. Back in 1125, around the time Matilda's first husband died and she began preparing to return to England, Stephen had married Matilda of Boulogne, who had just succeeded as Countess of Boulogne. This marriage made Stephen the lord of one of the foremost political entities in northern France, situated directly on the coast of the English Channel, as well as providing him with additional lands in Kent and southeastern England, further strengthening his position. Meanwhile, Matilda's marriage was troubled, and within a year of it, Matilda decided to leave Anjou and went to reside in Normandy. A reconciliation between Matilda and Geoffrey was eventually achieved in 1131. However, the entire situation had irritated Matilda's father, who believed she was allowing her personal feelings to obstruct the necessity of finding a lasting political resolution to the succession crisis. The final years of Henry's life saw a steady deterioration in the relationship between the king and his daughter. Although he never indicated any change in his intentions regarding the succession, that Henry remained resolute in his determination to have Matilda succeed him was perhaps a consequence of the events that transpired in 1133. In the spring of that year, Matilda gave birth to her first child, a source of relief after a long and largely childless marriage to Emperor Henry III, and several years of marriage to Geoffrey without producing an heir there either. Born on the 5th of March 1133 at Le Mans, the boy was named Henry by his parents in honor of his grandfather, the king. This choice represented a clear statement to Matilda's father and the wider political realm that Matilda now had an heir of her own, and that if she did indeed become queen following her father's reign, it would function as an interim period of sorts in preparation for the eventual accession of another King Henry in the future. The king was overjoyed, and the birth prompted him to cross to Normandy to see his grandchild. A reconciliation appeared to have been effected between him and Matilda. However, it proved short-lived. A year later, Matilda gave birth to another son, this one named Geoffrey. The birth was difficult, and at one point it seemed that Matilda might die, leading to a new dispute with her father concerning the terms of Matilda's own will and her proposed burial location. Thus, the improvement in relations between father and daughter did not endure for long. Matilda's father died on the 1st of December, 1135, while in Normandy. Although he was approximately 67 years of age at the time, He had been engaged in military campaigning in northern France against a rebellion of some of the Norman lords at the time of his death. Despite the fact that the king had never wavered in his support for Matilda as his successor, his daughter and son-in-law were offering some degree of assistance to the rebellious lords at the moment of Henry's death. The king's death was rumored to have been caused by consuming too many lampreys, a type of fish. While some form of food poisoning might have been involved, his death at such an advanced age could just as plausibly have been due to natural causes. As news of his death spread, it became evident that not all of Henry's lords and knights intended to support Matilda's claim to succeed him. Instead, many immediately began plotting. Stephen of Blois, Matilda's first cousin, quickly seized the initiative. Within a week of the king's death, he was in England and actively soliciting support from senior church figures and nobles. He then gained the enthusiastic endorsement of the people of London and was finally crowned as King Stephen III at Westminster Abbey on the 22nd of December 1135, just 3 weeks after Henry's death. Stephen had managed to secure the crown in contravention of the wishes of Henry I, largely due to fortunate timing and positioning. When news of the old king's death began to circulate, Stephen was not far from Normandy, residing in Boulogne, and was therefore best placed to cross quickly to England. The same could not be said for his brother, Theobald of Blois, another potential candidate for the throne. Similarly, Matilda was further south in Anjou and had barely enough time to react before news arrived that Stephen had been crowned at Westminster in England. Another factor that limited Matilda's ability to prevent Stephen from seizing the crown was that she was pregnant again when her father died and would give birth to her third and final son, William, in mid-1136. Each of her sons, Henry, Geoffrey, and William, would be known to their contemporaries and for centuries thereafter by the names Henry Fitz-Empress, Geoffrey Fitz-Empress, and William Fitz-Empress. Fitz signifying son of an empress, referring to Matilda's decision to continue using this title long after the death of her first husband. Matilda and Geoffrey did not immediately initiate military action against Stephen in an attempt to reclaim the throne for Matilda. They simply were not in a sufficiently strong position to do so. Instead, they would wait for a few years, gradually accumulating allies and preparing militarily and financially for the impending conflict. The event that precipitated their move and led to the outbreak of the civil war known as the Anarchy occurred when numerous powerful lords in England publicly declared their support for Matilda's cause and their opposition to Stephen in 1137 and 1138. The most prominent of these was Robert of Gloucester, an illegitimate half-brother of Matilda's, whom Henry I had elevated to the rank of earl and granted extensive lands in England. From the moment of Stephen's initial arrival in England in December 1135, Robert had indicated his reluctance to accept his cousin as the new monarch, attempting to obstruct his coronation. He was now joined in pledging his support for Matilda by Ranulph of Chester, another influential English earl with considerable landholdings and support in the northwestern part of the country. For a time, Matilda also gained the support of King David of Scotland, who harbored hopes of acquiring further lands along the border through his involvement in the Civil War. The anarchy commenced when Robert of Gloucester openly rebelled in 1138. The following year, Matilda arrived in England at the head of an army from France. Over the next few years, the conflict would develop, with Matilda, Geoffrey, Gloucester, and their other allies controlling much of the West Midlands and the West Country on behalf of Matilda's cause and establishing the port city of Bristol as their primary operational base, while Stephen retained control over London, the surrounding home counties, and East Anglia. Most of the fighting during the anarchy would take place in the Midlands and regions such as Oxfordshire, which lay strategically between Bristol and London. Conversely, he had spent periods of time in England since the mid-1110s and possessed extensive estates there, whereas Matilda, although born in England, had always been a distant figure, residing in Germany, Italy, and France. Stephen also appears to have exhibited greater humility, while English commentators took pains to emphasize Matilda's proud and often overbearing disposition, a trait that led one writer to describe her, even in her later years, as having a tyrannical inclination. All of this was underscored by her insistence on being addressed as Empress Matilda. Undoubtedly, the most significant events of the anarchy, excluding those that would eventually bring it to a close many years later, occurred in 1141. Early in that year, Stephen was conducting a siege of Lincoln Castle when Robert of Gloucester marched with several hundred knights and a considerable contingent of Welsh allies to relieve the siege. The Battle of Lincoln commenced on the 2nd of February 1141. Shortly after Gloucester and his forces arrived, it resulted in a decisive defeat for Stephen, one where many of his allies abandoned him under pressure from Gloucester's troops. Stephen and his immediate companions found themselves surrounded in the midst of the chaotic fighting, and despite their attempts to cut their way out, Stephen was captured by Gloucester's forces. Now a captive, he was transported westward towards Bristol, where Matilda ordered his imprisonment within Bristol Castle. This extraordinary victory left Matilda seemingly triumphant, although Stephen's cause was far from extinguished. No sooner had news of the king's capture reached London and Westminster than his wife, whose name was confusingly also Matilda, began assembling troops to retaliate against the Empress and to sustain Stephen's claim. The brief conflict between the two Matildas that would follow would soon precipitate another significant alteration in the military and political landscape. All of that, however, was still several months away. In the immediate aftermath, Matilda had secured a major victory over Stephen and held her principal adversary captive. She now proceeded to assert her birthright and realize her father's desires for the succession by assuming the rule of England. Yet a curious detail marked this transition. Although Matilda generally employed the title of Empress and was now aiming to become queen, she did not formally adopt either of these titles. Instead, she issued royal charters and grants using the designation Domina Anglorum, meaning Lady of the English. In early April, she and her supporters, along with certain leading figures of the English Church whom she had persuaded to join her cause, arrived at Winchester, home to one of Europe's most magnificent Gothic cathedrals and a highly important center of the medieval English Church. The rout of Winchester was significant because Robert of Gloucester was also captured during the fighting, with her most important ally and half-brother now in the custody of Stephen's wife and her confederates. Matilda had no recourse but to arrange for Stephen's release from Bristol. Consequently, not much more than half a year after defeating Stephen at Lincoln, capturing him, and having herself proclaimed as Lady of the English, Matilda was compelled to release her cousin, and the Civil War reverted to being as hotly contested an affair as it had ever been. Because Matilda did not abandon the titles she had adopted in April 1141, historians of the period generally consider that there were, in effect, two monarchs in England who had been crowned through different processes, King Stephen and Queen Matilda. This dual rulership situation would persist throughout the 1140s. This period was characterized by a truly unusual frequency of instances in which the leaders of the Civil War were captured, imprisoned, escaped, or narrowly avoided detention. Matilda herself experienced two close calls. The first occurred in 1141 when she was at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire. This stronghold had been constructed approximately 50 years earlier by the Bishop of Salisbury and had become one of the most important fortifications in southwestern England by the end of Henry's reign. Matilda was present here in 1141 when some of Stephen's forces arrived. They appear to have been unaware that Matilda was at Devizes. Nevertheless, any attempt by her to try and escape would have undoubtedly resulted in her being discovered. Consequently, she decided to escape clandestinely by dressing herself in burial clothes and having herself bound onto a funeral bier. Her attendants then carried her out of Devizes as if they were transporting a corpse. Apparently, Matilda remained in her prone and bound position for many hours until the company had moved entirely out of the region where Stephen's forces were operating and reached the safety of Gloucester. A second narrow escape occurred in 1142. Following the rout of Winchester and the release of Stephen and Robert of Gloucester, the fighting in 1142 began to concentrate around Oxford. Stephen became aware that Matilda had relocated her government to this location by that time and concluded that if he could capture her, it would deliver a decisive blow and bring the war to an end. Thus, in the autumn, he advanced on Oxford, the site of an impressive castle and a town that had already begun to emerge as a center of higher learning. Caught unprepared by the advance of Stephen's forces, Matilda and her followers found themselves trapped inside Oxford Castle as a siege commenced from September 1142 onwards. By the winter, more than 2.5 months into the siege, conditions within the castle were desperate, with Matilda and the others severely lacking all manner of supplies. However, Stephen's plan to capture her was thwarted. In December, the Lady of the English and a small number of close followers escaped from Oxford Castle and evaded detection by Stephen's troops, making their way back westward towards Bristol. There are differing accounts of how she managed her escape. One narrative suggests that Matilda simply left through a postern or rear gate of the castle. Another tale, more dramatic but not entirely implausible, claimed that Matilda and her allies climbed down a rope from a castle window to safety and then made their escape dressed entirely in white to blend in with the snow that had blanketed Oxfordshire that December. Whichever account is accurate, it is confirmed that Matilda made yet another narrow escape and continued to actively oppose Stephen into the mid-1140s. While the war had experienced many fluctuations and turns in England in 1141 and 1142, matters were more straightforward in northern France. Here, Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, had invaded Normandy and largely taken control of the duchy on her behalf in the early 1140s. Normandy would remain predominantly under Angevin control for the remainder of the war, with Geoffrey effectively consolidating Normandy with the counties of Anjou, Maine, and Touraine to become a French lord whose territorial holdings and power could rival those of the King of France. By this time, the opposing sides of the war had clearly delineated themselves. France had been lost to the Angevins, while in England, Matilda controlled the West Country, the West Midlands, and a portion of northwestern England, while Stephen maintained a secure base of support in the south, the home counties surrounding London, extending north to East Anglia, and further north towards York. The Midlands served as the primary front line. However, the Anarchy, as the chronicles written at the time make emphatically clear, was causing widespread devastation throughout England, as local lords and knights exploited the chaos and the breakdown of royal authority as an opportunity to expand their own landholdings and enrich themselves. The mid-1140s represented a period of relative inactivity in the Civil War compared to the dramatic events of 1141 and 1142. Initially, the two opposing sides became evenly matched and solidified their control over their respective territories in England. Then events occurring far to the east conspired to limit the scale of the conflict. In 1144, the county of Edessa, one of the four major Christian Crusader states that had been established in the Levant as part of the First Crusade some 50 years earlier, was captured by a Syrian Muslim military leader named Zengi. When news of these developments reached Western Europe, a new crusade was proclaimed and garnered widespread support. The King of France, Louis VII, was among those who pledged to join the crusade and journey to the Holy Land. With their feudal overlord committed to the Second Crusade, many French lords who constituted the backbone of Matilda's support in the civil war against Stephen agreed to also travel east, although some were ultimately diverted to Iberia, where Lisbon was conquered for the Christian cause in 1147. To further complicate matters, several of Matilda's other allies died during the mid-1140s, including Geoffrey de Mandeville, the Earl of Essex, who was killed in a military engagement against Stephen's forces in 1144, and her most loyal ally, her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, who passed away in relative peace at Bristol Castle in the late autumn of 1147, nearing his 60th year. All of these factors contributed to a lull in the fighting during these years. The period that followed witnessed a fundamental transformation in the character of the war. By then, Matilda's eldest son, Henry Fitz-Empress, was entering what would be considered his teenage years in the modern era, but which in the medieval period were regarded as the initial years of adulthood. In this context, he was increasingly put forward as the potential future king should Matilda and her allies achieve victory in the conflict, with the possibility even that Matilda might rule in conjunction with her son. As early as 1147, at the age of just 14, Henry crossed to England from northern France, leading a substantial force of mercenaries who had been hired to compensate for the departure of many troops who had gone on crusade. A symbolic changing of the guard followed as Robert of Gloucester died, and then Matilda herself left England in 1148. This latter decision was partly prompted by a dispute between Matilda and the Bishop of Salisbury, Jocelyn de Bohun, over the ownership of Devizes Castle, the stronghold in Wiltshire from which Matilda had made her dramatic escape disguised as a corpse back in 1141. The bishop asserted control over Devizes, despite Matilda often residing there. The dispute had escalated in the mid-1140s, with de Bohun even involving Pope Eugene III, opting to minimize her losses, and with her son now assuming a more prominent role in affairs, Matilda headed for France. She would spend the majority of the remaining years of the Civil War at Rouen in Normandy. The political landscape continued to evolve in the period that followed. A pivotal moment occurred when Matilda's second husband, Geoffrey of Anjou, died suddenly and unexpectedly at the age of just 38 in September 1151. A chronicle written by John of Marmoutier claimed that Geoffrey had been attending a council of his nobles and advisors at Le Mans when he was suddenly struck down by a severe fever. His illness was rapid, and he died on the 7th of September. He was buried in St. Julian's Cathedral in Le Mans, where Matilda commissioned an effigy of him to be placed over his tomb. On this effigy, his personal coat of arms, featuring a blue shield and gold lions, was displayed in one of the earliest examples of the use of a heraldic coat of arms in medieval Europe. It is significant that Matilda commissioned this effigy and that the coat of arms in question influenced the royal coat of arms of subsequent English monarchs for centuries to come. Geoffrey's death otherwise cemented Henry's status as the leader of the military effort on his mother's side, as he became Count of Anjou, now aged 18, and effectively Duke of Normandy as well. Already demonstrating himself to be a shrewd military commander and political leader, Henry, in collaboration with his mother, began employing a diplomatic strategy in the early 1150s, whereby the papacy, the King of France, and the lords of England were all courted to support Matilda and Henry's claim to the throne, with the realization that diplomacy might achieve what war had failed to gain over the preceding decade. On the opposing side, a rival to Henry was emerging. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, was a few years older than Henry and was being presented by Stephen to the English political class as his successor. This was even more pertinent on that side of the English Channel, as Stephen was approximately a decade older than Matilda, and it was probable that he would predecease his first cousin. Thus, from Normandy in the early 1150s, Matilda was acutely aware that the struggle had become one to determine whether Eustace or Henry would succeed Stephen. The time when she might claim the throne herself and reign in her own right, in fulfillment of her father's aspirations from so many years earlier, was gradually passing. Events culminated around the siege of Wallingford Castle in 1153, where Stephen hoped to defeat one of Matilda's key English allies, Brian Fitzcount. Henry campaigned against Stephen to prevent this. After yet another stalemate had been reached that summer, an agreement was concluded, known variously as the Treaty of Wallingford and the Treaty of Winchester. Through this agreement, Henry consented to abandon his efforts to displace Stephen and accept him as the King of England, on the condition that upon Stephen's death, Henry would succeed him, not Eustace or any of Stephen's other sons. The Treaty of Wallingford seemingly brought the anarchy to a conclusion after 15 years of civil war and decades of underlying tension over the succession. One can only speculate as to Matilda's reaction in Normandy when news of the agreement reached by her son arrived there. The settlement was perhaps not as firm as it might appear, however. In the months that followed, Stephen embarked on a rapid series of activities to rally his allies and tour England. This activity suggests a suspicion that he was formulating plans to attempt to repudiate the agreement and recommence the war when the timing was politically advantageous. However, just as the deaths of members of the royal family during the White Ship disaster in 1120 and of the aged King Henry in 1135 had initiated the anarchy, the deaths of two royal figures in quick succession brought it to an end in the mid-1150s. First, Eustace died unexpectedly in August 1153, and then Stephen passed away just over a year later in October 1154. With these deaths, the anarchy ceased. Matilda had emerged victorious, although the triumph was largely for her son, who swiftly secured control over the government of England following Stephen's death. He was crowned on the 19th of December 1154 as King Henry II at Westminster Abbey. Fittingly, during the ceremony, one of the crowns utilized was the one that Matilda had brought back from her time married to Emperor Henry V in Germany 3 decades earlier, a symbolic acknowledgement of how Henry's mother had maintained her lineage's claim to the throne since her days in Central Europe as a young woman. With Stephen's death and the accession of her son as King Henry II, Matilda found herself, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, no longer actively fighting a war to claim her birthright and implement her father's wishes. She had not become queen herself, but her eldest son, whom she had symbolically named after his grandfather, had achieved this. Matilda was triumphant, and she now entered a period of semi-retirement. She did not reside in England, choosing instead to remain in Normandy and spend the rest of her life there. Although Henry held the title of Duke of Normandy, his mother acted as one of his principal representatives in the duchy, as the new king, unlike his great-grandfather and grandfather, William the Conqueror and Henry I, primarily regarded himself as an English monarch rather than a French lord, who also happened to be King of England. During these years, there was also a symbolic effort to acknowledge Matilda's position as the daughter of King Henry. Consequently, despite her retirement in Normandy, royal charters and other government documents from the latter half of the 1150s and into the 1160s bear the names and royal seals of both Henry and Matilda, a tacit acknowledgement that although Henry was the reigning king, he had only attained this position through his mother's decision to step aside and allow him to succeed Stephen. Matilda was a major benefactress of the Augustinians in northern France, both during the tumultuous period of the Anarchy and especially during her semi-retirement, when funds could be directed towards this purpose rather than towards raising armies. However, both the Benedictines and the Cistercians also benefited from her generosity. She provided funding to the Abbey of Bec in Normandy, for instance, an institution she had supported for decades, and also to Bordesley Abbey in Worcestershire, England. In all these instances, there was an awareness of the political advantages of supporting religious abbeys and houses, which often played a notable role in local politics, something Matilda had recognized in her early years in Germany and had subsequently utilized as a political tool for decades. Her initial support for Bordesley, for example, dated back to the early 1140s, when she cultivated relations there as a means of securing control over Worcestershire within the context of the Civil War. Setting aside any purely political motivations, there is no doubt that Matilda was a genuine advocate of church reform and revitalization, and she continued in her later years to support the church in Normandy and in more distant regions. Matilda remained far from politically inactive in the years following her son's accession as king. Although most of the letters exchanged are no longer extant, it is clear from chronicles and other supporting evidence that Matilda maintained extensive correspondence with her son during the latter half of the 1150s and into the 1160s, with letters traveling from Normandy to England and back again, offering him counsel on many political matters. One particular topic on which she attempted to advise Henry concerned Thomas Becket, a leading churchman and politician whom Henry had appointed as Lord Chancellor of England shortly after his accession. In 1162, Becket was promoted to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury within the church hierarchy. This elevation brought the formerly loyal chancellor into conflict with Henry, as the two men clashed over the rights and privileges of the church and the extent to which the archbishops of Canterbury were answerable solely to the Pope in Rome, or were also required to seek the permission of the kings of England before taking action on various issues. The dispute would intensify throughout the 1160s. Matilda advised Henry to de-escalate the situation. He did not heed her advice, and ultimately in 1170, Becket was murdered in Canterbury Cathedral. Although the extent to which Henry authorized the assassination has been a subject of extensive debate ever since. She also advised Henry against launching a military expedition to Ireland in the 1150s with the intention of commencing the conquest of the neighboring island from its many Irish lords. Perhaps she was correct in her counsel. Henry did eventually authorize such a campaign after his mother's death, initiating centuries of English involvement with Ireland. Matilda was in her 60s when her son's relationship with Becket began to deteriorate. She ultimately lived to be 65 years old, considered a venerable age for the time. Her later years saw her withdraw from a central role in all political matters, undoubtedly enjoying the frequent visits of her grandchildren to Normandy. Among these grandchildren would be two future kings of England, King Richard I, more famously known as Richard the Lionheart, and King John, two queens, Eleanor, Queen of Castile, and Joan, Queen of Sicily, and also several lords and ladies of other significant political entities. Her son and grandsons would come to rule over vast territories in England, France, Wales, and even parts of Ireland, forming what became known as the Angevin Empire, a recognition of her marriage to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. The Plantagenet family name, which she acquired through that same union, was borne by the rulers of England until 1485, when the House of Tudor rose to power at the conclusion of the Wars of the Roses. Matilda died at her home in Rouen, Normandy, on the 10th of September 1167. She was laid to rest at the Abbey of Bec, which she had supported for decades. Her remains, however, were moved, lost, and rediscovered on several occasions over the centuries, eventually finding their current resting place at Rouen Cathedral in the mid-19th century. At Bec, her original tomb still bears the epitaph, quote, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring, Here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry. Empress Matilda stands as one of the most remarkable political figures of the High Middle Ages. During a long and eventful life, she attained the title of Holy Roman Empress and was involved in the governance of parts of Germany and Italy while still little more than a teenager. She then became the Countess of Anjou in the late 1120s before engaging in a major civil war that spanned nearly 2 decades, seeking to claim her right to become Queen of England in fulfillment of her deceased father's wishes. She demonstrated herself to be a formidable opponent, managing for a period in 1141 to seemingly defeat Stephen and assert her birthright. Although the rout of Winchester and the subsequent release of her first cousin snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Admittedly, her unwavering determination to become Queen of England caused significant suffering, casting the country into disarray, economic ruin, and prolonged conflict. However, Matilda was not alone in her desire to end Stephen's reign. Many shared this objective. Ultimately, her persistent efforts ensured that her cause survived long enough for her son to come to prominence and resolve the fundamental issue that had initially triggered the war: the controversial prospect of a female monarch. In the end, Matilda was not able to fully realize her father's plans for the succession, but the accession of her son as King Henry II in 1154. What is your assessment of Empress Matilda? Do you believe she would have proven to be a capable queen had she been permitted to rule by both Stephen and the English nobility? Or were her actions and personality ill-suited to the challenges of governing at that time?